lots of new faces here, for sure, because it's my first time here. And so lots of content, so I'll jump in right away. Joyful React testing. I am named after Edmonton, though, for real. OK. So let's take a look at a component for an email campaign. Is it cropped a little?
Yeah, I'll fix that.
All right, thanks. What better way to start a talk with a political campaign?
The computer got bumped.
OK. Yeah. So if you like safe speed limits in Edmonton, you're welcome. If you don't, then come talk to me. And so this is a React component and a bunch of them together. Very simple. You type your address or postal code, then it will resolve the counselor. Let's go back to that. And from there, you can email them, call them, and in a pre-filled email template. So let's focus on the search bar. It's going to have a couple states. When you start typing, we receive input events, and we'll show the loading circle. And we will throttle those events because we don't want to hit our server for every keystroke ever pressed. And after it's settled, then we will show the clear button. And then call the callback on query change in React. So fairly straightforward on paper. And here's what the implementation could look like. And it's a rough draft, so don't look at every line. We just want to test the part where it shows the search icon and the clear button. So let's try testing this. The two states, if there are no query in the text box, then we'll show a placebo search button. And if there are some text in the search box, we'll show a clear button. So in the fantasy land, for every well-designed test, right, we'll have just that. If we can do that in React, right? Given the query, when it's rendering, then we expect the clear button to be visible. And some people call that input, action, output. Right? And the characteristics of good unit tests have all these components in there. Now, let's go back to our implementation and see if we could do that. What we're interested in is the query, so we're going to have some help here. Mr. Monaco. This query comes from the top in a state. This is using React hook. I hope people are familiar with that. Anyway, it's a string that comes back from this function. And the way it changes is by calling setQuery. So someone else could be calling setQuery. That's what we know. And then it could be a new value handler that could be called by onChange or onClearQuery. And so what we want to look at is onChange, because that's when we receive the events for typing inputs. And so now we finally got where does our query state get changed. OK, so this is what our test could look like with our component that's designed on hand. We'll have to find the input bar, some jQuery or regular selector, and then fire some input events, simulate some key press, and then find the clear button, and then assert if they are visible, if the clear button is visible. And if you are pausing here and say, oh, you should use accessibility labels, yes, we could. But this code doesn't work. This test will always fail. Can anyone tell me why? Because we're throttling those events, right? So when the test runs, the throttling isn't done yet, so we won't see anything change. So we have to have a set timeout in our tests, which is pretty awful. So don't actually take any picture of this. And all of that just to test this one state in a search bar. And we have a bunch of other things that we haven't even touched on. And these are the friction and challenges and roadblocks that people usually see when writing unit tests. And no wonder we find it a chore to find proper unit tests and then spending the time to do it. It's more like a hindrance than helping you with TDD preaching that, oh, it can help you write components design better, da, da, da. So let's see how we can find joy in testing. Now, first thing will be dumb components. People also call that pure components, read-only components, or presentational components. And if you're familiar with pure functions, the concept is the same. So, given some input, always return some output. So our dumb component will render the same markup given the same prompts. So no states, no reading from network, no reading from global variables. And that maps perfectly with our characteristics of well-designed unit tests. The trio of given, when, then, and input, action, output. So let's refactor that awful component and see where we can use these dumb component concept. We'll bring back our friend, Mr. Monaco. And let's see here. The query is set by this new value handler. And actually, all of that stuff we don't need. I want you to focus on the markup. So whatever is returned here, everything in there is ultimately what we need for this to render on the screen. And so let's make our props pass in all of that and get rid of everything in between. Now you notice we're also passing in a clear button here. Why, we'll see in a second. Part of the reason is because we can. In React, you can pass in anything that JavaScript can hold. And in this case, we're passing an entire component type, which you can use as a regular component. As below, we'll see we're setting the props on clear query as we would normally do for the button we're using. And now we have this pure dumb component that have all its inputs from the props, and then its output, it's only dependent on those arguments. Our unit test could look like this. This is where you clap. So 3 lines and a trio of well-designed test-driven development and the assertions that we need. Now, the first line here, clear button, is a mock function from our test utility, yes. And the syntax of error function, if you've paid attention to Mark, you know that given some argument, it will always return a React fragment. So what you see on those bracket, close bracket, is a React fragment. So if you're not familiar with that, just think of that as 2 diffs. One diff, parent, and then closing tag. And in React, this is the functional component. Pass in some props that we ignore, and then always return the same markup. Now this clear button gets passed to the dumb search bar along with the query. And because our DOM search bar looks at query and see if it exists, it will draw the query button. When query button gets drawn, our function gets called with the props and then with the markup. And in our assertion, we look at this query button, see if it's been called. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And now compare what we had and what we do now. We won't ever want to write this again. Right? So every time you find yourself drilling into the guts of some components with some accessibility labels, with some class names, take a step back and see if you can refactor some of that into DOM component and have it pass in a component type that would define what your component needs to render. And some people call that parameterization or dependency injection. The concept is the same. So now we looked at our first toolbox, tool in the toolbox, and next we have touched on that just now. So if it's still confusing, it may help to have some pictures. What we had was a query button inside search bar. It is going to fire a callback to the parent component. And we have this implicit dependency because there's no way we swap out query button from outside search bar. And we also don't know how to select the query button or whatever is inside of that. What we have done by taking query button as a prop is to remove that dependency. Now, the only thing that is coupling these two components is the callback prop. So this is what we want in a composable component that is engineered for testability and maintainability, having loosely coupled components, as many of them as possible. And so what we have seen, we can swap out the query button for the test query button. There we can run assertions on how many times it has been called, what kind of props has it been called by, and so on. Now this example only has data flow from the query button to the search bar. Let's look at one with two-way data flow. It's a good thing we're all having pizza, because I was worried if I show this picture when everyone's hungry, then what will happen? So I was given the option to start the talk before we have pizza, but I'm not going to be the reason. Like, you can do pizza. So, pretty simple component. We're just going to pick a crust with a dropdown. So again, the parent component pizza builder have an implicit dependency on dropdown. And it's hard-coded to have items and select item pass down. And dropdown will call the callback in the other way on item select. So what we want to get to is pizza builder having the dependency only through these props. So then again, we can swap out the crust selector to a test crust selector and assert the props and how many times this has been called. At a call site, pizza builder will look like this. Right? You can pass in the test dropdown, just like any regular component. And what this also allows us to do is if your marketing team called and they say they want to add a new option, other than thin and thick, they want to add cheese. But there's one caveat. They say the dropdown has a visibility issue. Because the default is thin, so people don't really click the dropdown. And I'm afraid if we put cheese in there, it's not very discoverable. Can we use a radio button instead? So then you're going to tell them, yes, because you've attended this awesome talk that lets you do that. All you need to do is swap out the cross selector to a radio group. And because radio group implements items, select item, and calls your on-item select, that is all you have to do. So what we're seeing here is engineering for testability not only makes your tests easier to maintain or evolve, but also make your production code way more resilient to changes and adapt to any new requirements, which we know they come in every day. So we've looked at component type as props, and we're going to look at the last thing, because it's all nice and all with dumb components, component types, but we still need our throttling logic. So that's where component enhancers come in. Some people call that higher order components. If you know higher order functions, which is basically a function that takes a function as an input and output another function. Higher order components is the same thing. I like calling them enhancers because that's what they do. They take a component type, enhance that into another component type. So the enhancer itself also fits nicely into the testing trio. Given, when, then, input, action, output. So let's try looking at a really simple enhancer that does nothing. In React, if we want to write an identity function for our component type, this is how we do it. We're passing a component, and we're going to return another component that will take the props and spread it onto the existing component. So spreading syntax just means everything that passed in as props will get passed into the original component. So now this doesn't do anything, and in our call site, search bar and same search bar is exactly the same. Now with component enhancers in about, let's see how an implementation could look like for the bouncing. Still quite a bit of code here. So we'll bring out Mr. Monaco. And first, look at the markup. All right. We're using the spread operator here for REST. So the only thing we're interested in enhancing is onQuery change. And with onQuery change as a prop to the enhanced component, we also get support for onQuery for free if you use this enhancer. And at our call site, it will look like that. So you pass in the dump search bar. Now with the bounce query change. And this component will just look like all of the other ones, except its input will be throttled. So let's take your attention to the search bar. And what we can do is pull it out into a separate file and use it as an import. So now your app becomes so your dump search bar is in your app, and your debounce search bar is also in your app in separate files. Dump search bar, which we know is a dumb component with rock-solid unit tests, because given the same input, it always returns the same output. And when we use an enhancer that is also unit test, our debounce search bar really doesn't need too many tests, because The with debounds query change enhancer is unit test. Dump search bar is also unit test. And what you want to do is maybe look at the integration and see how it works out. For our React component, this will also be covered in our UI tests. So now let's look at what we had before. A bunch of query selectors to drill into the guts of component. And we started writing dump components along with passing component type as props. And along that with component enhancers, there you can have your React app engineered for testability. So to recap again, we'll make our components dumb by pulling out the markups and have the props passed in, return the same markup every time. And when we utilize component type as props, it allows us to write tests that look like this. Simple assertions of given, when, then, describing input, action, output. And finally, we'll use component enhancers to isolate side effects. So that includes any network calls, any set timeouts, any disk access, reading and writing. And with these three tools, we can have testable, engineered components in our app. And I'm going to leave you with a bonus. Every time you see map in your code, in your React markup, that's when you should start paying attention. So if you know what Mark just talked about, the map function takes some input and returns some output. If you use that in your React component, usually you're taking an input and returning some markup. Now that sounds like a component right there. The input from the map is the props, and the markup is the output. So there, you can have a free dumb component every time you use map. You can refactor it to look like this. Now, remember the spread syntax we saw earlier? We can use that here too. The dumb component of email button that takes all those 4 props is also passed by the email providers. And because the email function, the component itself is written as a function, we can also pass that to map. And with that, our mapper is just one line. This is where we were, and below is where we are. Now, the email button has its own unit test that is now rock solid. So every time you see map, pay attention and extract that out for free. This is something you can do today, right now. And last thing for UI tests, also known as all of these names that we call them, write them. And historically, they are also a pain in the butt because a bunch of selectors that you have to do and wait around for network calls to get done. There is a pretty new software, Cypress, that I use and find it very helpful. So the code is very simple. To select, to click, it will be very smart to wait on any callbacks, any network requests, and it will also record the test results like we're seeing here. So usually UI tests are harder to maintain because when it does find bugs, it is hard to pinpoint where it went wrong, like a unit test. So for that UI test, if you're familiar with the pyramid, we won't write as much of them. But for our unit test, we will write a lot of them at the bottom because they run very quickly. And with the toolbox we just saw, you can write a lot of them. And reliable, not flaky unit tests. So with those, your middle layer for integration tests will probably have a lot of duplicate with your UI tests. And in that case, the pyramid may look like an arrow. Fat at the bottom with a lot of unit tests. Testing the code paths that are hard to reach from your UI, like obscure error handling, or some URL query parameters hitting your server that you want to test. And then leave your UI test to test the things that your user will see immediately if your app is broken. So there it is. Go spark some joy. I'm going to leave this video running in the background while I take questions. It's kind of nice to look at that. Have it run clicking click like that. So thank you.
Thank you first.
Thank you. Questions? Yes. Do I run this from the? Can you run it from the server? Yes. So all of this is open source on my GitHub, and they also run with Azure pipeline from Microsoft. Every time the unit test and the UI test pass, it will automatically deploy to GitHub pages. And if there are any failures in the UI test, it will save the video and screenshots and send you a report. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question? So you did some throttling there in your components for the
Mm-hmm.
input events. So you tested like kind of the event that was triggered after the throttling with the dumb components. But like the actual throttling logic and stuff, was that tested? Like, did I just miss that part, or how did you test that part?
Yeah. So the question is, we test the dumb components without throttling, and in our actual code shown on the UI, we have throttling. So where's that tested? And our throttling logic is encapsulated in the enhancers. Right? And enhancers have the same characteristics of well-written unit tests, the trio of input, action, output. So our enhancers themselves are well-tested unit test. And so anything that gets passed in to the enhancer is the only service of bug. So, but because we're passing in dumb search bar, which is well-tested and rock solid, then we know the result is rock solid. So yeah, test your enhancers. That's where state changes. That's where network call happens. That's where set timeouts happen. And usually bugs happen when you set state and when you have competing timelines going together. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.